Professor Oreskes, before we get into the specifics, you wrote the book, Merchants of Doubt, about how the same small group of scientists helped industries, tobacco, fossil fuels, chemical companies, cast doubt on research that threatened their products. So I want to ask you, how common is it for corporations to essentially purchase the science that regulators use to decide whether their products are safe?
That's a very important question and a very hard one to answer because obviously, when corporations do this sort of thing, they don't boast about it, they don't announce it in public. And so it takes a lot of work. As you pointed out in this particular case, the paper that has only just now been retracted was published in the year 2000, so 25 years before it finally got retracted. So it's really hard work to expose these things. There aren't a lot of us who have jobs that enable us to do this sort of work. And so it makes it very, very hard to say for sure. But if I had to guess, my instinct would tell me that this particular paper that we've been tracking is not unique.
Let's get into some of the details about this paper. So, Monsanto's Roundup is the subject of this paper. It's the most widely used weed killer in the world. What does that actually mean for the average person? How does it end up in our bodies?
It means a lot because it can end up in our bodies and in the environment around us in a number of ways. The most obvious way is that because this is a herbicide, it's widely used in agriculture. And so pesticide residues can end up in crops that we either eat directly, if it's fruits and vegetables, or in products made from those crops, such as corn syrup or corn flakes made from corn that was grown using these herbicides. So this is a very major source of potential exposure, but it's not the only one. And one reason why I think glyphosate is so important for the American people to understand is that it's also widely used domestically. If you go to Home Depot, to Lowe's, to your local Ace Hardware store, you can find Roundup products on the shelf that you can buy and use at home. And we know that millions and millions of Americans do. They use it in their gardens, they use it in their lawns. My own husband used it recently to try to get rid of Japanese knotwood, and I threatened divorce. No, just
I
kidding.
was just going to ask you, Professor, did you
That's
say
right.
over my dead body?
Well, it was before I had written this paper, but I already knew a little bit about the issue. The point is, it's incredibly widely used, and it's widely used in part because the manufacturers have insisted that it is safe. But I think we have good reason to be suspicious of those reassurances and to be worried about the exposures we get using this product around our house, around our pets, and in our own home vegetable gardens as well.
So I just want to emphasize an important point that you're making right now, which is how widespread the use of this is, that there really is no way to get away from it. I mean, we're talking about it being used not only for all different types of commercial agriculture, for things like soy and corn, which comprise so much of the American food system, to the domestic use of it when folks are trying to kill certain pests and invasive weeds on their lawn.
Exactly.
So, a study published 25 years ago gave it a clean bill of health. And late last year, you helped pull that from the scientific record. Briefly summarize what happened to get us here.
Sure. Well, the paper, as you said, was published in 2000, in the year 2000, so 26 years ago. It was ostensibly authored by a group of academics, and it was presented as a comprehensive, capacious, and independent review of all of the scientific evidence related to glyphosate. And this was really important because these sorts of review articles are often heavily relied upon by regulatory agencies. However, in 2017, as a result of lawsuits related to alleged harms from this chemical glyphosate, it became clear, it came out based on emails written by people from Monsanto that this paper had been ghostwritten. That is to say, that Monsanto had come up with the idea for the paper, it had organized the data, and it had recruited academics to put their names on the paper as if they were the authors and as if they were independent when in fact they were not. So this is a form of fraud. It's a form of misrepresentation. The people whose names are on the paper are not, in fact, the authors of the paper. So this was exposed in 2017, and yet this paper had never been retracted. So I had the idea, working with my postdoc, Sasha Korov, that we should pose the question, well, how much impact did this paper have? Maybe it didn't have any impact, and we could just say, oh, well, it's bad, but it didn't really do damage. But that's not what we found. What we found was that this paper was extremely widely cited, one of the most widely cited papers on the question of glyphosate safety. It had been quoted in approximately 40 government documents, some of which were directly related to regulatory decision making, others were indirectly related, and it was widely relied on in Wikipedia articles, which is where many of us get our information about these matters. It's also where AI goes. When you pose a question to Chat GPT, where does Chat GPT go? Mostly to Wikipedia. So it meant that this paper, this misleading, misrepresentative paper, had been widely influential in scientific circles, in government circles, and in the public understanding of this chemical.
There are multiple things that you are pointing out right now, Professor Oreskes, that I want to hit. I want to start first with the notion of ghostwriting. For people who aren't in the sciences, I think many might hear, oh, a paper has been ghostwritten, and they think about a celebrity's autobiography. This is
Yes,
something much different. Talk about that.
exactly. Yeah, so it is quite different. It's quite different for a couple of reasons. So first of all, it's true, as you say, often when celebrities write their memoirs, they don't really write them. Famous actors or whatever, not necessarily good writers. So often they have a person who helps them write the book, or maybe even does most of the writing. And that person is often referred to as a ghostwriter, but usually, not always, but usually, if you look at the cover of the book, it will say, by famous person with Robyn Vincent, right, or with Naomi Oreskes. And so that with is the giveaway that the second person is the ghostwriter. And how much work the ghostwriter does varies. Sometimes they write the whole thing, other times it's a kind of as told to sort of story. And I think most of us have a sense about that. Ghostwriting in science is really different, and we probably should even come up with a different name for it. Because in science, first of all, the person whose paper is on the person whose name is on the paper is expected to be the author of the paper. And in science, that doesn't just mean that they wrote the words, it means they did the work, they analyzed the data, and then they wrote it up. And this is one reason why often scientific papers have multiple authors, because often one person may have done more. One person maybe did most of the data collection, maybe some others did the data analysis, maybe the lead author took the lead on actually writing the paper itself. But all of those people are expected to have been directly involved and done the work that they said that they did. And it really matters, because if they didn't, there's at least two problems with that. One is that it's just dishonest, right? Science is rooted in the notion of honesty. We have to trust what we're reading in scientific literature, otherwise, the whole system breaks down. The whole point of science is to find out the truth. So if people are lying about what they did, then the whole system is potentially thrown up for grabs. And then the second reason it's really problematic is that when I read a scientific paper as an editor or a reviewer or just a reader, I'm making judgments about it in part based on the expertise of the author. So if I read a paper by someone who's very famous, very well known, who has a very high reputation in the scientific community, I should still read critically. Of course, we all should, but I'm more likely to say, oh, well, that's a really famous person. That person's really famous for doing work in this area. He's an expert. He knows what he's talking about. And so scientific ghostwriting basically exploits that. The companies find people who have good reputations, recruit them to put their names on these papers as a way of giving credibility to work that possibly doesn't deserve that credibility.
Professor, do these folks then tend to lose that credibility when things like this happen? Or is it that this doesn't even happen often enough, that there aren't that many papers that even get retracted in this way? So there is less concern that academics have about being recruited and doing this.
Yeah, that's a great question, too. I think that there is concern. I think that there's enough evidence of this sort of thing going on that there is concern. And certainly there have been people, particularly in the area of pharmaceuticals, there have been people who have written about this issue and who have said we in the scientific community need to do more to stop these kinds of practices. But it is true that in general, the scientific community has been slow to react. And I don't know exactly why that is. I think some of it is, um, I don't know, no one wants to be a snitch. Some of it is that it is very hard and time consuming to do the kind of work that Sasha and I just did. And most scientists are busy trying to do their own work. So they don't really have the bandwidth to be really double checking other people's work. And then also, most scientists assume that the journals are doing their job, that the journal editors and the peer reviewers are checking these things to make sure they're valid. But here's the problem with ghostwriting: you have no way to know, right? If it hadn't been for the lawsuits involving glyphosate, we would never have known that this paper was ghostwritten. And if you look at other examples that we have in the literature, almost all of them came out of lawsuits, because in lawsuits we get documents, we get emails, we get memos, and we get to see people and corporations saying, oh, let's ghostwrite this paper the same way we did for that glyphosate paper. And that's how this came out. It was a memo where someone says, oh, that glyphosate paper, that was really effective, we should do that again. And that was partly what triggered me to say, oh, well, was it effective? And that's what led to the research that we did. But most scientists just don't have the time, the bandwidth, or the funding to do this kind of investigation.
But then, even when the truth does come out, it takes a long time for things to change. I mean, I'm going back to another point that you made earlier, because this detail really strikes me. The emails proving Monsanto employees wrote this paper came out in court in 2017. Professor, that was 8 years ago, but your research found that scientists and regulators just kept citing it. Why doesn't the scientific community have a better immune system for this kind of thing?
Well, it's a great question. I think one of the things that our work shows is that the scientific community needs a better system, and that scientists need to be taking this on board and saying, okay, what can we do now to prevent this sort of thing happening again in the future? But you can see why it's difficult, because if you're just a scientist doing your work, you wouldn't necessarily know about this lawsuit that's going on in France. And even if you knew it was going on, maybe it raises a little red flag that glyphosate isn't as safe as they've claimed. But are you going to sit down and read all of the documents that came out in a lawsuit? No, of course not. You're not a lawyer, you're a scientist. And so there's a gap between where this information is being exposed, who's reading the information, and who needs to be taking action about that information.
Professor Oreskes, one thing from your research that I think is going to surprise people, you found that the claims in this ghost written paper ended up in AI training data, in, as you noted, Wikipedia articles, in the data sets that power chatbots. I want to think about this for a minute. What does it mean when compromised science gets baked into the systems that millions of people now use to get their information?
I think it means we're in big trouble. And especially because it's not just about glyphosate and it's not just about Wikipedia. And I want to make clear, I love Wikipedia. I'm not beating up on the Wikipedia editors. Um, but if you think about what is on the internet, all AI systems work by churning up and regurgitating what it finds on the internet. So AI is not, in my opinion, intelligent. AI is an incredibly efficient masher. It's like making mashed potatoes. So that means that if there's bad information, disinformation, incorrect information on the internet, AI will find that information. And so, in particularly in contested areas, the sorts of things I've worked on, like climate change, tobacco control, now pesticide regulation, there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation on the internet. And that means that any AI system runs the risk of recapitulating and presenting to you, the reader, wrong information. And so this is something that we have to really be worried about, and that I really wish the tech industry would take more seriously. I know there are some people in the tech industry who do take it seriously, but the potential for disinformation to rule the airwaves, as it were, is very, very great.
This is so thorny, Professor, because I think we all want to be skeptical about the information that we're consuming. I know certainly for me as a journalist, that's something that I am always trying to do. However, something that I learned in my training was that there are certain sources that are trustworthy. And scientific data, scientific papers have long been one of those sources. I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, I don't want to push it too far. I don't want to sort of imply that one bad apple, poisons the whole barrel. I think that the vast majority of scientific work in peer-reviewed scientific journals is still valid, and I think we're still right to want to look at primary scientific information when we're looking at scientific questions. That's certainly more likely to be valid than a lot of the other sources that we could turn to. But I think it also means that the scientific community really has to take this issue seriously and think hard about having better safeguards to make sure that these sorts of things are rare. I don't know that we'll ever be able to eliminate them completely. No matter how good security is, there are still bank robberies. But I think the scientific community could do more. And in particular, I think the editors of journals need to do more. So it used to be when I was first getting my PhD, you submitted a paper to a journal, they didn't even ask you who had paid for it or if you had received funding from outside sources.
Wow.
Now most journals do, so that's a step in the right direction, but there's no enforcement mechanism. And most universities are very reluctant to penalize academics who are shown to have not disclosed financial conflicts of interest. So I think that editors need to try to figure out ways to be stricter. So, for example, if an editor finds out, as the editor did in this case, that a paper was ghostwritten, those authors should be banned from ever publishing in that journal again. And there should be some way of making that public so that other editors could be aware of it as well. So there should be real penalty for this kind of malfeasance. When it comes to universities, we did look into a few cases that have been documented in the past. One was in Canada. The university looked into it and basically said, well, it was an error of judgment, but no big deal. So that's not good. Universities need to do more to say, no, this is a kind of malfeasance. It compromises not just the integrity of that particular paper, but as you said, Robyn, it compromises public trust in science as a whole. And that we cannot stand by and let that happen.
What you're saying is that there need to be real consequences when these sort of things happen, and then there is the hope that that's going to deter some researchers from putting themselves in this position and essentially being responsible for disinformation that is kind of cemented in the public record for some period of time. Professor, I want to zoom out to what's happening in Washington right now. This is very interesting. The
Yeah, I
EPA,
was afraid you were going to ask about that.
afraid but maybe slightly excited, right, Professor?
Well, maybe, maybe.
The EPA has to finish a new safety review of glyphosate this year. Glyphosate was the main ingredient in Monsanto's Roundup, and you have pointed out that the ingredients may have changed slightly. Nevertheless, the EPA has to finish a new safety review of glyphosate this year, but it's lost most of its research scientists to budget cuts. Now, enter RFK Jr. He was part of the legal team that sued Monsanto and won a major verdict. Now he's in an administration siding with Bayer, and that's the company that owns Monsanto in a Supreme Court case. That case could effectively block tens of thousands of Roundup cancer lawsuits. As someone who studies how science and politics intersect, what do you see when you look at all of that at once?
Well, I see a huge threat to American public health and safety, and also to environmental health, because we know that glyphosate affects birds and amphibians and gets into the groundwater. So, this is potentially extremely consequential. So, one reason I'm happy to be with you here today is because I really think the American people need to know about this. And one of the things that not you personally, Robyn, although you could do it too, anyone who's listening, one thing that's depressing about the work that I do is it sometimes makes people feel like it's all kind of hopeless,
Right.
and it can make me feel like you know, what in the world can we do, especially against these incredibly powerful corporations, and then this very complicated and in this case very messy political landscape. But there are things we can do. So the this new EPA rule is subject to public comment. I believe the public comment period is about to open up. You can find it by googling EPA public comment glyphosate, and you can write to the EPA and you can say, I believe that there are serious questions about the safety of this pesticide and that it should not be uh, approved, or it should only be approved for limited uses in highly managed occupational settings, or whatever you think, whatever conclusion you come to is the right conclusion based on what you've learned. Or maybe the conclusion is we need more research, and the research has to be done by independent scientists, not paid by the company that makes this product. And so people can do that, and your comment doesn't have to be long. It could just be a couple of sentences. You can refer to my published work if you want. Some people think that helps if you refer to published scientific data. Also, super helpful in this case, and I want to give a big shout out to the editor Martin Vanderberg, who retracted the paper after we made him aware of it. Not all editors do that. A lot of editors just want to say, it's not my problem. That was a different editor, a different country 20 years ago. It's very easy for people to wash their hands of things that someone else did wrong. But Martin Vanderberg didn't do that. He looked into this, he investigated, he did his own inquiry into this paper and wrote a very, very powerful retraction statement, which maybe we can make available on your website, laying out all the reasons why this paper was problematic. That would be a great thing to cite in a public commentary. So it's not just me saying it's ghost written, but it's actually the editor of the journal that published and retracted it. So there are things we can do. Letters to editors to help inform your fellow citizens about this problem. And of course, uh, the Supreme Court will always insist they don't pay attention to public opinion, for better or worse. I don't believe that's true. I believe there are people who live in the world and they talk to their friends and they talk to their families and they talk to their children. And I think that the more we get this into the public domain and the more that we say, sure, of course we want food. No one is denying that we want food, but we also want a safe and healthy environment. And what is the point of food? The food is the point of food is to keep us healthy. We need to eat to live. But if the food we're eating is contaminated by toxic chemicals, then that can't be right. Something has to be wrong with that picture.
Thank you for that note of hope, Professor. You are clairvoyant because the next thing that I was going to ask you is for someone listening right now thinking, what can I actually do about this? What would you tell them? And so I love that you have given people some actionable steps that they can take, that this is not a foregone conclusion. You've spent 2 decades documenting this pattern: tobacco, oil, pesticides. After everything you've seen, my final question to you is, has it made you trust science less or weirdly more?
No more, because it's really underscored the crucial importance of independent science, right? Because I don't blame a corporation for wanting to defend its product up to a point, right? You make a product, you think it's a good product, and you certainly don't want to pull that product off the market based on some very scant evidence. But this is why independent objective science is so important. And I do believe, and I've been doing this work for 40 years now, I do believe that the vast majority of scientists are honest, and that the vast majority of scientists want to know the truth about the things they study. That's why they become scientists. Most of us could have worked in the private sector if we'd wanted to and made a lot more money, but we do science because there's something incredibly gratifying about feeling like we are, in fact, learning the truth about the world, and that maybe those truths can be used to keep people safer, happier, healthier, have a deeper relationship to the world we live in. So my net takeaway is that science is so essential. And if you think about all the things you just mentioned, tobacco, pesticides, climate change, we wouldn't know the truth about these things if we didn't have independent science. It wasn't the tobacco industry that told us that its product killed 100 million people in the 20th century. It was independent scientists working at places like the Sloan Kettering Cancer Institute, working at places like Harvard Medical School, working at medical schools and clinics and universities all across this country. And it was that independent science that made it possible for the American people to say, no, we don't accept this. We are going to regulate tobacco. We're going to ban smoking in airplanes and restaurants. We're going to try to quit if we can. We're going to try to figure out how to quit if we've become addicted. So the science was really, really empowering, both for people as individuals, for individual smokers, and also for the country as a whole, to try to control tobacco and dramatically improve public health. So all of this work just makes me believe in science even more. And it's also why I'm passionate about cleaning it up, because I do think that if we want people to continue to trust science, which I believe they should, and which, by the way, polls show most Americans still do trust science despite all the confusion out there. If we want the American people to continue to trust science and to continue to fund science, then we, the scientific community, have to do our part to make sure that our science is as clean and as honest and as objective as possible.